This prisoner had a peculiar hobby. Every time he was free to move around, he would deliberately get close to the guards and stealthily observe the keys on their belts. Once back in his cell, he would meticulously draw the outline of the keys, redrawing any slight inaccuracies until they were perfect. Moreover, at 3 a.m., he would quietly light a match to observe the keyhole of his cell door closely. Then, he would tear off a piece of paper and carefully stick it on the keyhole to get its outline, which he would then draw with a pencil. After doing all this, Tim would slowly insert a rolled-up piece of paper into the keyhole, followed by a pencil. After 20,000 rubs, Tim successfully measured the depth of the keyhole. Despite this, he remained worried because the materials to make a key were hard to obtain. The next day, Tim shared his situation with his cellmates, Stephen and Leonard, hoping for their help. Leonard thought of a risky but good idea. For the sake of freedom, Tim decided to take the risk. So, during their time in the carpentry workshop, he stealthily took a few blocks of wood and hid them in his thermos. However, an accident happened on his way out. Due to his nervousness, Tim's unnatural expression raised the guard's suspicion. The guard picked up Tim's thermos, emptied the water inside, and shook it a few times. Strangely, after inspecting it, he found nothing unusual and reluctantly let Tim go, unaware that his negligence would soon bring shame to the entire prison. Once back in his cell, Tim eagerly took out the wooden blocks from the thermos. He managed to evade the guard's search because he had prepared a countermeasure in advance. When the guard approached, a cellmate deliberately knocked over a box of nails to distract him, while Tim stuffed a towel into the thermos to secure the wooden blocks at the bottom, thus narrowly avoiding detection. With everything ready, Tim began to work on the wooden blocks. He stared intently at the wood in his hands, not missing any detail, even sanding down the corners to make them smooth. Soon, all parts of the key were made. He then applied glue and carefully assembled them, using the overhead incandescent light to speed up the glue's drying. 10 minutes later, Tim took out the wooden key. After ensuring the parts were firmly glued together, he compared it with the drawings and made the final adjustments. After repeated refinements, he finally made a wooden key. With a nervous heart, Tim slowly approached the cell door and carefully inserted the key into the lock. Holding his breath and full of anticipation, he turned the key. With a crisp sound, the iron door actually opened. Tim revealed a joyous smile, but his joy was short-lived as he faced a bigger problem. The thick iron door mercilessly shattered Tim's hope, plunging his mood from the peak to the valley. To make matters worse, the lock on the iron door could only be opened from the outside. Tim decided to make the second key and then figure it out. During the day, he seized every opportunity to memorize the shape of the guard's keys, and at night, he secretly made them. A week later, the second key was finally completed. Tim took advantage of a collective work break, asking Leonard to keep watch nearby while he tested the key on the cell door lock. Whenever he encountered resistance, he would directly take out the tools hidden in his sock and adjust them on the spot. Excitingly, after a few simple modifications, Tim easily opened the iron door. However, as Tim prepared to pull out the key, he was horrified to find the key suddenly stuck. In a panic, Tim accidentally applied too much force, causing the key to break inside the lock, which terrified him. At this moment, Leonard, who was keeping watch, issued a warning. Tim anxiously and desperately picked at the lock cylinder with his fingers. In a desperate situation, Stephen brought a screwdriver from the room, and Tim, seeing it as a lifeline, immediately began to clear the lock hole. As the footsteps approached, his cellmates urgently urged Tim to stop. Fortunately, a second before the guard arrived, Tim successfully removed all the wood chips, but the bolt was still exposed. After the guard left, Tim quickly ran to the door, trying to use his fist to push the bolt back, but it was futile. The bolt didn't budge. With no other choice, Tim had to give up. Lying in bed with a nervous heart, he awaited the impending punishment. Soon the guards came over to lock the door and Tim looked up uneasily. Unexpectedly, the guard saw the exposed latch and simply looked around for a moment, then relocked the iron door. Inside the cell, Tim's heart raced, but after a long wait with no incident, he finally breathed a sigh of relief. Clearly, he had narrowly escaped this time, but he still hadn't given up on escaping. Not long after, Tim made another key, but how to open the door became a problem. So, he consulted with his cellmates, Leonard and Stephen, for a strategy. They quickly thought of a good method, tying strings to both ends of the key and passing it through the cell door, manually controlling it to precisely insert it into the lock hole. However, Tim immediately shook his head in refusal.
If you can't turn it, it's just totally pointless.
With no other choice, they had to think of another way. Just then, a guard suddenly came for a cell check, and the three immediately shut up and pretended to be busy. The guard pushed open the iron door.
What were you talking about?
Nothing, meneer. We were just talking.
Perhaps.
The atmosphere in the cell instantly tensed, but fortunately, the guard didn't think much of it and left after a brief look. A while later, Leonard went to the door to confirm the guard had walked away before they relaxed. As they were about to continue discussing their strategy, Stephen suddenly looked at the broom in Leonard's hand and fell into deep thought. Then, they went outside to close the door, while Leonard stayed inside to test with the broom. Excitingly, the broom's length was just right to reach the lock core. The only problem now was how to turn the key. One day, while working in the carpentry workshop, Tim noticed a cellmate using a lathe to process wood, and a bold idea instantly emerged in his mind. He first prepared a wooden board with a hole, then drilled a hole at the top of the broom. He connected the broom and the board with screws, and the key was fixed in the hole on the board, completing a simple crank and rocker mechanism. Everything ready, Tim couldn't wait to start the test. He carefully inserted the key into the lock hole, then clenched his teeth and forcefully turned the key. His idea actually worked, and Tim was extremely excited. But before he could celebrate, he suddenly noticed a patrolling guard seemingly looking in his direction. Tim was scared out of his wits and immediately prepared to remove the key. But unfortunately, due to his nervousness, he accidentally dropped the key on the ground. If the guard discovered it tomorrow, all his efforts would be in vain, which Tim couldn't accept. In a desperate situation, he took out a piece of chewing gum he had been reluctant to eat and chewed it vigorously. Then, he went to the window and stretched the broom out as far as possible, trying to use the chewing gum to stick to the key. He carefully retracted the broom, almost succeeding, but suddenly the key and the chewing gum fell to the ground together. At this moment, Tim was extremely anxious and close to breaking down, but he could only continue trying because the stickiness of the chewing gum would soon disappear, leaving him with little time. Fortunately, after several attempts, he finally succeeded in retrieving the key. After the crisis was averted, Tim finally lay back on the bed in relief. The next day, he couldn't wait to share the good news with his cellmates, and the three of them immediately saw hope for escape. In the following days, they began to make keys for the remaining cell doors in the same way. All the finished parts were secretly buried underground to avoid sudden searches by the guards. A month later, all the keys were finally made, and the three planned to test them that night. Tim first made a dummy with clothes, then met with Leonard. The two, barefoot, tiptoed downstairs to test each key. To escape from the prison, they had to pass through 15 iron doors, each with a different lock core. Tim prepared 39 keys. They had to test each lock hole for the corresponding key and mark them. However, they had just tested one iron door when a patrolling guard approached, forcing them to retreat. It was too late to go upstairs, so they could only hide in a storage locker downstairs. Despairingly, the locker couldn't be locked from the inside, and the door couldn't be fully closed. Reluctantly, Tim had to use his hand to pinch the screw on the door, but the screw was too short, making it difficult to apply force, and it soon slipped from his hand. Worse, the guard was approaching. The two were terrified, stiffening their bodies, staring outside without making a sound. At this moment, the guard would never have imagined the two prisoners had escaped and were hiding in the storage locker. He walked upstairs as usual for a routine check. Tim's prepared dummy successfully deceived the guard's eyes. He glanced around casually before turning away. Meanwhile, the two in the locker quietly opened the door and tiptoed forward. After confirming there were no other guards, they continued testing the keys. Soon, they arrived at the last iron door. However, just as Tim inserted the key into the lock hole, footsteps suddenly came from upstairs. The two realized the guard might have finished patrolling, so they quickly locked the iron door and returned to the locker. The guard also just returned downstairs, and as expected, he didn't glance at the locker. After the guard left, the two sneaked back to their cell, with Tim trembling uncontrollably. He forced himself to calm down, disassembled the key, and hid it in a water cup. However, the next morning, 3 guards stormed into the cell, staring at Tim without saying a word. It turned out the alarm had been ringing for half an hour, and Tim was still sound asleep in bed. Woken up, Tim stood up in a panic, facing the guards' questioning. Tim kept apologizing, but the guards sensed something was off.
20 years experience in this job tells me you slept through my bed because you're tired. And you're tired because you're not sleeping. Why aren't you sleeping?
Tim remained silent, and the guards had no choice but to order a room search. After a round of inspection, they found nothing unusual. But just then, the guards suddenly stopped their actions and turned to look at the ground. The key parts were scattered on the floor, causing Tim's heart to race. A guard picked up a part, but after looking at it for a long time, he didn't know what it was. Tim had a quick idea and immediately picked up a nearby photo, inserting it into the parts gap and standing it up. The guard was speechless.
What an utterly stupid idea.
Seeing no evidence, the guard could only warn Tim before leaving reluctantly. After this incident, Tim realized he couldn't wait any longer. The next day, he gathered other prisoners, planning to invite everyone to escape together. But to his surprise, not a single person planned to leave. They all feared the consequences of a failed escape attempt, but with freedom just a step away. Tim and the three didn't plan to give up. They were determined to act that night. In the evening, after the guards left work, the entire prison fell silent. Tim began to act, first releasing Leonard and Stephen from their cell. They quickly changed into prepared casual clothes and jogged to the door. However, just as Tim was about to open the door, he suddenly heard noises downstairs. They held their breath and slowly retreated, ready to flee backward. Only when the noise downstairs disappeared did the three dare to continue, quietly moving downstairs. They planned to temporarily hide in the storage locker to avoid the guards' first round of checks. But after entering, they realized the prepared paperclip was missing. Tim searched the ground but couldn't find it, so he had to continue pinching the screw with his hand. They thought this time would be as smooth as before, but a guard came straight to the storage locker with a toilet plunger. It turned out the guard's toilet had suddenly clogged, so he came to the locker to find the plunger. When closing the door, he knocked off the paperclip on the screw but didn't pay attention. Now the guard was about to put the plunger back in the locker. Just as Tim and the three were about to be exposed, an inmate upstairs suddenly started shouting,
Mania! Mania calling you!
At this critical moment, the guard, annoyed by the noisy shouting, turned and walked upstairs. The three, who narrowly escaped, didn't dare to delay and quickly ran out, skillfully opening one door after another. Soon, they arrived at the last door. Even more surprisingly, the prison's main gate was wide open. They hugged each other tightly, celebrating their upcoming freedom. Then, the three suppressed their joy, quickly put on their shoes and coats at the door, and opened the last gate. But just as they walked out, they were horrified to find a guard patrolling the wall with a gun. Fortunately, they were prepared and took out a small mirror to observe the situation. As soon as the guard turned away, they quickly walked to the gate. In this way, the three successively reached the gate and then used the same method to walk onto the street. Even so, their hearts remained tense, walking forward silently with their heads lowered. Until two passing guards didn't recognize their identities, they finally breathed a sigh of relief. They ran wildly through the free world like untethered wild horses, unobstructedly reaching the station. Tim hailed a taxi and asked the driver to drive directly out of the border. The next morning, the guards, as usual, opened the cell door and called the prisoners to report, but Tim and the three didn't respond. When the guards arrived at the cell, they were horrified to find no Tim, only a crudely made dummy. The guard was puzzled, wondering how three living people could just disappear into thin air. But by the time he realized, it was too late. The three had already fled across the border by car. The film is based on a true event. They were political prisoners who opposed racial discrimination and wandered as fugitives after escaping, until they were gradually pardoned after 1991.